Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sharon Martin, an IFS-informed certified trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from survivors all over the world as they share their impactful story of thriving in their post-traumatic growth. We explore resources, tools, and coping skills to support the trauma survivor community. Enjoy. Hello, Trauma Survivorhood podcast listeners. Before we dive into today's next amazing interview, I just wanted to let you know about the upcoming May workshop that I'm going to be holding on Thursday night, May 16th, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This month's workshop is going to be focused on self-care. Ooh, what a buzzword, right? So why is self-care such a buzzword? What is self-care? What isn't self-care? Also, what is the brain science behind this big importance? Why is there so much emphasis for trauma survivors to have a self-care routine? Why is it even necessary? And also, how in our busy world, especially if we're trauma survivors on a healing journey, how can we find and make time for regular self-care? So $15 per person. Link is below in the show notes. I look forward to seeing you there. Welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I am your host, Sharon Martin. I'm an IFS-informed trauma recovery coach, and I have with us today Sharon Martin. Sharon is a LCSW. She's a psychotherapist and an author specializing in codependency recovery. For the past 25 years, she has been helping adult children to recover from difficult childhoods, overcome feelings of unworthiness, and learn to set boundaries. Dr. Martin is the author of the CBT workbook for Perfectionism and the Better Boundaries workbook. She also writes for the popular blog Conquering Codependency for Psychology Today. She's been featured in various media outlets, including Psych Central, WebMD, Women's World, Therapy Chat, and the Adult Child podcast. Sharon, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate that you are coming on to talk about these super important topics today. Tell us a little bit about your journey, how you landed in this field where you're working in now.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you and everybody out there. So welcome, everybody. And yes, well, as you read my bio, it makes me feel old, I have to say. I have been doing this for quite a long time, but I feel like there's different iterations of it and sort of different phases of the work that I have been doing and sort of thinking about how that's evolved. I think I come to this work like so many, probably everybody else really, as on some level that wounded healer and feeling like there's something internal about me, about our experiences that feels like it needs healing. And so I think from the very beginning it becomes a journey into trying to understand myself and my experiences and my place in the world. And so thinking back on some of those experiences for me, I really reflect on childhood experiences of feeling like there was just something wrong with me, something fundamentally that was off. And remembering a lot of the messaging that I got was you're too quiet, you're too sensitive, you're too shy. And like I said, that sort of formulated into this, there's something wrong with you. It was never like there's nothing wrong with any of those things, but I never got any of the messages that said these are great qualities or these can be strengths or these can be assets. So for me, this really morphed into perfectionism and an effort to try to be worthy, right? Trying to strive for really high ideals and achievements, always doing more and more and more to try to prove that I was good enough, I was worthy.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of the beginning of it all. And then I would say the other really important milestone, if you will, maybe, is that many years later, after I already was a therapist and I was married and I had 3 young kids at the time. And then my husband had a huge mental health and addiction crisis and he was in rehab and it just totally felt like my whole world was falling apart, which, I think in a lot of ways it was. And if we think about really the beginnings of codependency, this has been from its inception a label that has been assigned to wives of people who were struggling with addiction. So that became the deep dive for me into understanding codependency, again, for others and and for myself and trying to figure out, like, what does this mean? What role do I have in all this chaos that's going on in my life? And what is it about me that's, contributing or holding me back or making my life difficult in this
Mm.
moment? So that was where that sort of came into play. And they all, what I have found really is it all interweaves, and you sort of think, oh, there's these issues and these issues, and they meld and they play off of each other, and there's commonalities and different pieces of it. But like I was saying, I think it just sort of evolves over time as you
Yeah.
do your own work and work with clients and read and study and learn more as well. So
Yes.
that's the abridged version.
For sure. I think that it all does intersect. It sounds like there's a lot of different layers, right? So as you started to heal on some levels, there was new layers that were coming up where it's like, me too, my turn. I want to heal too. I know that's been true for my personal journey, and becoming a coach has just been part of that journey for myself and working with other trauma survivors.
Mhm.
So let's dive into this big, it's such a buzzword, codependency. So first, tell us what this actually means, how this actually presents. What is this big buzzword?
It is kind of hard to define.
Yeah.
And I want to share a couple of different ways that I've been thinking about it that aren't definitions per se, because I think, anybody can truly look online and get a whole list of signs and symptoms of codependency. And I've written many of them myself, and honestly, they can be very lengthy.
Yeah.
But one way that I have started thinking about it is the codependency is essentially love without any boundaries. So
Mm.
that might be one place that we could think about it. And then maybe another piece of it is that codependency is an effort to control your surroundings and other people, that there's this anxiety that runs through it that is really fueled by fear, insecurity that's
Mm.
underneath that. And that leads us to do a whole host of different behaviors, right? Everything sort of from the classic enabling
Yeah.
to worrying to, right, trying to, change things or feel like we're in control of it and needing things to be just so in our lives. Again, in this effort to feel some level of safety and control, where it feels like everything is just falling apart and there's chaos around us, and we want to, like, pull it all in and say, okay, I can predict what's going on here,
Yeah.
and feel again like that element of safety, that
Yeah.
of course we are all striving for, right, and
Yeah.
need.
At its core, this is a coping skill, like you said, very much based in fear, right? Because the brain doesn't care whether you're happy or living a nice, healthy life. It just wants you safe. And so the familiarity and predictability is really all the neuroscience behind that, is that the brain wants to know what's coming, right? And so having people that you can either manipulate to kind of control their path or make sure that they're safe, make sure that they're emotionally well, disregards anything that you actually wanted or desired, but it places all of that happiness on whether or not the people around me are okay. It does create, like, it's a false sense of security and safety, but to the brain it does feel like there's a safeness. And I know that for trauma survivors, the brain looking for safety in that controlling aspect of other people is really common. So do you ever see codependency traits or codependency patterns from people that haven't endured relational trauma?
Well, I yes and no.
Mm.
I think there's degrees of relational trauma, I guess, is one thing. So, right, sometimes relational trauma is very obvious.
Yeah.
Let's just say, right, it's huge. It's, big stuff that happened in your life. It's defining, things. And for other people, there's maybe shades of gray, and there's elements of relational trauma that I think often go missed by people.
Mm.
I think this is again one thing that where there's more awareness of it, we start to recognize it in places that maybe we didn't before.
Yeah.
But again, there's also a generational trauma aspect to this. So I think there are certainly people who might say, there's no big obvious relational trauma stuff that happened to me in my childhood,
Yeah.
but you were raised by parents who experienced more significant relational trauma. And so some of those coping skills that they learned, that again we might put into the codependent classification, get passed down.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of yes and no, I think, element to it
Mm.
is rooted in, in relational trauma, but it
Yeah.
doesn't have to be relational trauma that you experienced yourself. Or again, for a lot of people, it's really like a combination, right? Is
Yeah.
probably the most the most likely scenario. But I
Yeah,
think
thank
to
you for naming that. I think generational trauma is super important because you might just be seeing the codependent relationship between a parent and a grandparent and just think that's what love is supposed to look like. It might not even be your thing. You're seeing that as a relationship dynamic, or there's something that's passed down epigenetically that way. So that's really important. Yeah, thank you for naming
yeah, I see that quite a bit, where I'll have clients who will say, well, my childhood was pretty typical.
that.
There was nothing big. And again, it can be that combination of, once we dig into a little bit more, well, there really were some things that were more painful than they had been acknowledging or noticing for themselves. But then there's the piece about, well, what do you know about, what did you witness, what do you know about your parents' childhood experiences, your grandparents, and then it starts
Mm.
to become more obvious. But I think, to your point, I always say, or try to make a point of saying to folks, is that, all of these things that we would call codependent traits or behaviors, ways of thinking that are causing us problems in adulthood,
Mm.
are things that came from our efforts to cope
Yeah.
with what was going wrong in our lives as children. And when
Mhm.
you're a kid and you learn how to be a people pleaser, it's a pretty good coping strategy when you think about, you don't have a lot of resources, you don't have a lot of life experience, you don't have a fully developed brain, and so we come up with the best coping strategies that we can, and they serve a purpose, right? They work at least to an extent for us as kids, and then it's as adults that we often, feel like, oh my gosh, this is just holding me back. It's not allowing me to, advance in a relationship, a job, feel fulfilled, feel authentic, etc.
Yeah. Wow. Very, very important to recognize. It's later when your coping skills are then maladaptive. They started off as adaptive, right? And my longtime listeners know with the IFS training and how much I love parts work in IFS, right? There are no bad parts. Your coping mechanisms were designed to keep you safe and to try to keep you as well as they could in the moment. It's later in life when you want to move forward, you want to expand, you want to advance, you want to widen your spectrum, and you're realizing that these are now kind of weights that are holding you back. So I love what you said earlier, this idea of exploring codependency as being love without boundaries. So this is this other big buzzword: boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. What does that look like when someone doesn't have boundaries? How can they self-assess if they're listening right now and they want to self-assess? What does it look like to not have boundaries?
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of different pieces. Like, one thing we could think about is the idea of an enmeshed relationship. Sorry, it's hard
Mm.
to say.
And yes.
Right, which is exactly a relationship that doesn't have boundaries. And what happens is there's not a lot of differentiation between one individual and the next. So you end up feeling like you're sort of an extension of somebody else rather than your own full, complete, separate self, who
Yeah.
can have their own ideas and opinions and beliefs about things. And so there's this, when you're in the enmeshed relationship, and that, like I said, you're this extension of somebody else, it means you need to sort of be just like them. You're not allowed to fully be yourself or explore who you might be.
Right.
And there's this deep sense of, you must be loyal, you must do exactly what we want you to do. And again, this can happen between parent and child, it can happen between spouses. I mean, there are other scenarios, different kinds of relationships where it can manifest. But
Mhm.
in thinking about the parent-child relationship, it's like the child really can't grow up and
Yeah.
become their own self. If we think about, stages of development for kids, right? Usually in adolescence is the big period in which we are allowed to and expected to explore our own identity. But if you have an enmeshed relationship with your parents, it's like they're holding on to you. They're saying, be just like me. You can't be anything else. Or it's a, crime against this family, essentially. You're disloyal and we can't tolerate that. So that's one piece of it. And you're getting that sense in that idea here that, a boundary is both a limit. If I'm setting a boundary with somebody, I might be saying, no, please don't do that. That's hurtful to me. Here's a limit. Or it could be, I need to decline your request to babysit your kids 5 days a week. And I say, no, here's the limit. I'm not able to do that.
Right.
But it's also the boundary defines who you are as an individual. That's the other piece. So if we don't have boundaries, we don't have a separate self. We're just sort of, a blob that's, like meshing into other people. And we're not able to, be assertive essentially and stand up for ourselves. And here's where we become vulnerable then to people who are going to take advantage of us or manipulate us or abuse us because we don't have a voice. We don't have the ability to say, stop, that's not okay. Or like I said, that doesn't fit with who I am, my values and my goals. And even you can think about a lack of boundaries in terms of not being able to move forward with your goals, feeling like your time is spent on things that don't matter to you.
Right.
Your money is being spent on things that aren't in line with your priorities, etc. Because again, we're just sort of pulled in all these different directions, trying to make other people happy without an ability to say, hey, this is who I am, this is what matters to me, and I need to act in accordance to those goals, priorities, values.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds, there's so much thread of self-abandonment here where if someone really, especially in childhood, grew up in the developmental years of the developing brain, when you really actually don't even have a sense of who you are or your desires, your needs, your wants. So how can you set a boundary until you really have even figured out whether or not you even want a boundary here or not? And so there's a lot of like undoing and uncovering that sounds like has to happen here, especially in enmeshment where you've become that person. Where do we start with this? So someone's listening and they're going, yeah, that's me. I've never even known who I am. I'm totally self-abandoned, no boundaries, definitely always been in codependent relationships. Where do they even begin? Because I know I'm thinking specifically for trauma survivors, this might just be an I'm not sure how to get to know myself level, all the way to the I was raised in an abusive home where there is a safety component for me people pleasing, and all the way to the trauma responsive fawning. Like, how can that be safe to even start exploring that, taking those baby steps?
It's a good question. It's a big one, Sarah, I will say.
That's why I leave it
Um,
to the expert.
yes, but I think as you're saying already, I mean, part of this is we're going to take baby steps, right? We're not going to go from no boundaries to lots of boundaries all in one fell swoop. It's very much a skill that you're going to learn. And I, tell people it's like learning how to cook or drive a car. If nobody taught you how to do this, then you should not feel bad that you do not know how to do it. It is something that we need to learn by watching people who have healthy boundaries. And it's something that we need to practice over and over and over again until it starts to feel more comfortable to us. So there's a couple of things I think in what you were saying. One is that, yes, there is most likely a need and a place for some self-reflection and some self-knowledge that we need to get, because that is what is going to inform our boundaries, is that we need to know what matters to us and right who we are, a bit about ourselves, so that we can figure out what are the boundaries that we need. We can also start with just, there are some universal needs, as we've been talking about. Like safety is a big universal need, right? We all need to feel safe. And we also know just basic human needs like sleep and eating and things like this, that again, you might not think of it this way, but we need boundaries around our lives so that we can make sure that all of those needs are met for ourselves. So I think that's one place to start, is right with those really basic kind of needs, and thinking about, okay, how can boundaries help me ensure that I'm going to get enough sleep tonight? Right. So again, there's different kinds of boundaries for different kinds of situations. The other thing that this makes me think of is, if you're not really familiar with boundaries, what we really need to do is also sort of see them in action. And so one thing that people can do is start to pay attention to what other people in their lives, or even books or movies or television shows, look for examples of boundaries that are working.
Mm.
You can also look for boundaries that are not working, but I mean, we probably don't really need to do that because we all really know or have experienced what that looks like, right?
Yeah.
But try to find some examples of what healthy boundaries look like, and ones that sort of are appealing to you. Because again, boundaries are very individual, so we can't just say we all need exactly the same boundaries. Um, but anyway, that can give you an idea of what it can look like to set boundaries. And again, that's some can sort of replace some of the modeling that maybe that you didn't get growing up.
Mm.
And then, like I said, there's definitely a place for practicing those boundaries. And usually what I say is, you start practicing with small boundaries. So again, we're not taking this giant leap. And also start practicing setting boundaries with other people who are people that are pretty emotionally healthy, people that you feel safe to be able to try to set some boundaries with. Again, don't try starting to set boundaries with the people who are the most difficult and the most sort of anti-boundary in your life, right? Start with, a good friend, or a spouse, if that's a positive relationship for you. And sometimes you can even tell these folks, like, I'm working on learning how to set boundaries. So you're sort of giving the lead in so that they can hopefully support you in those efforts when you are doing it, rather than working against you. But we also want to remember that anytime we're making some significant changes in ourselves,
Yeah.
it is going to have a ripple effect, into our relationships. And so, again, if these are generally pretty emotionally healthy people that we're interacting with, they
Yeah.
will be able to adjust to the boundaries, but we need to give them some time. We
Yes.
can't just start, going again from no boundaries to now I'm setting boundaries all the time with my friend, and expect that they're going to understand and be on board with it. The fact that you get a little bit of pushback from some people
Yeah.
doesn't mean they're never going to get on board with this or respect your boundaries.
Right.
I think this is where we often go, again, because of the trauma history, we go to assuming, oh, I'm setting a boundary and she's questioning it. That means, oh, this was a terrible mistake. I've done the wrong thing. I've ruined the friendship, and she's never going to respect this boundary. And
Mm.
that may not be the case.
Right.
I think it's hard. And of course, it takes a lot of courage to give it a couple of tries to see if this is really how it plays out or not.
Yeah.
Because, of course, I mean, it certainly is a
Sometimes doesn't.
possibility. Right. It doesn't always. And I think that's what people forget, is that there are people who will respect your boundaries.
Yeah.
And it's easy to just put everybody into the same big, pile and say, oh, nobody respects my boundaries.
Yeah.
So even just this idea of sort of looking for people who might respect your boundaries could be a helpful exercise, in looking at some of the relationships that you have in your life as well.
Yeah, starting small, starting with people who you already kind of have a basis of boundaries for themselves so
Yes.
that they'll be willing to respect yours. But then it is a good weeding out tool later as you get stronger with someone who relentlessly refuses to respect your boundaries. That means it's a new boundary
Yeah.
called this person needs to be on the other side of my boundary. I love this idea of also like kind of like starting like low and low and just grab that low hanging fruit because that will build momentum. And we also know that we trauma survivors have this beautiful adaptation where everything is black and white because gray and nuance is really scary. And what Sharon was just talking about, folks, was a lot of gray and a lot of nuance, right? Immediately, it's like, oh, this person will never respect my boundaries, or oh, this person is definitely not going to respect my boundary and they're not going to even like me anymore. We just kind of go right to those
Yeah.
extremes because the middle can be very scary. So remembering that this is going to also bring in a lot of new gray nuanced area for you to be practicing. So it's overall really helpful for your trauma recovery because it's challenging you in that area as well to recognize, oh, wait, I can be safe. And someone is going to, even though they're just questioning, they're not really pushing back. They're just asking more about it. Like stand firm in it and they will respect that, or they can't. It's an option for them to respect it. Like you said, not everybody might, but I love this idea too of practicing. And I love to give people a lot of grace in this area because we do sometimes see people who all of a sudden come into their own. They get that wild momentum because now they've been practicing boundaries on probably those safe people. And then everywhere they go, they're shooting a boundary everywhere they go because now it's like this new learned thing. And it's like driving a car. You're not great at parallel parking, but you think you can do it everywhere you go. And so you just keep doing it and you're holding up all the traffic. And that's okay because I want people to remember that there's a pendulum in this. We're talking about codependency. We're talking about no boundaries, no sense of self, or a lot of self abandonment way over here. And when you let that go, it might go pretty far to the other side until you can find a balance. And so respecting people who are kind of throwing out a boundary, like just, whoa, all you had to do was ask. You don't have to do this whole I'm setting a boundary thing and like getting all sharp. I'm safe, I'm okay. So encouraging people when you see them really being really sharp with their boundaries, giving them that grace to know if they're just learning this might be this wild new tool that they're just so overexcited to use. Because we see that sometimes. I did hear something interesting that I want to ask you about. I've heard it said that a true boundary for me requires nothing of the person that I'm setting the boundary, because that would be an expectation. Is that the right way to phrase that?
Well, I think what you're getting at here is the idea that I would say, I mean, the best boundaries or the most effective boundaries are the boundaries that I'm doing something to change myself,
Yes.
essentially. Certainly, boundaries can involve asking somebody else to make a change.
Mm, yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with that in relationships, that we can ask people to make a change. What we want to remember is that's all it is. It's a request.
Yeah.
It's not a demand. And
Yeah.
if I let all of my boundaries hinge on requesting other people to make changes, I'm going to be disappointed a fair amount of the time because again, that's something I have no control over.
Yeah.
So again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And certainly I encourage you in relationships to have dialogues. I think the other thing that people forget is that boundaries can be flexible in a number of ways, and they can certainly, there is a place for certain boundaries that are non-negotiable, right?
Mm,
That are just so hard and fast that this is a non-negotiable safety issue is basically what those come down to, is really safety issues
mm,
for us. But there are a lot of boundaries that we actually can negotiate in close relationships. So again, this is where we get into the gray and it gets hard. It's easier if we feel like, oh, I could just write out a list of all my boundaries and those would be sort of my rules or things that I
yeah.
would do all of the time in all situations with all people. But it doesn't work that way. We're
Oh man.
constantly, right? We're constantly shifting our boundaries, both because we're always changing. My needs are changing. And my boundaries are really set up for me to help get my needs met. But again, we also need different boundaries with different people in our lives, right? You think about, different folks in your lives, and that makes a lot of sense. So there is a lot of place for the boundaries to be flexible.
Mm.
Um, yeah,
Staying
and
fluid.
yeah,
I think that
yes,
sounds
yeah.
important to just recognizing you're changing. Everyone else around you is also this ever-changing being. And yes, I totally agree. Definitely different people are going to need different boundaries. Some of them are going to have to be more sharp, like, hey, I keep
Mhm.
asking you this, you're not listening, because those are people who tend to not respect the boundaries or just are more needy. They tend to ask you too much. And now you're like, you know what? I've said no so many times. Now I'm going to actually ask you to stop asking me, right? Because you've got people that are more needy, and then you've got other people who are not that way at all, just in their personality is just not like that. So it's a
Yeah.
beautiful way to have these nuances inside of different relationships without having to constantly be strapping someone to the wall and saying, you stay there, I'm over here, and really trying to define um, yourself from them, because they're, this interconnected world that we're in. You don't want an enmeshment where you lose yourself, but you do want to enjoy space with other people and kind of be in that bubble with them. That's
Mhm.
enjoying life with other humans. So I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. And I think if we just tie this back to the codependency piece that we were talking about, and that need really to feel like we are in control of what
Mm,
other people are doing sometimes. Um, right, sometimes it feels like it's almost easier if I'm trying to get somebody else to change, and I'm saying, you need to stop calling me these names, or you need to stop coming home late, or whatever it is, and it feels like, oh, I'm setting a boundary, I'm saying this is not okay with me, and I'm right, but I'm relying on somebody else to make a change in that situation. Again, if it's a relationship where there can be a negotiation and where that can work, that's fine, but if it's not, you're essentially creating a situation where you're powerless now, right? I have given this person all of the power to decide my happiness, right? If they're not going to stop doing whatever the offending behavior is, then I feel like, well, what else can I do? I have no options. All right, your options
mm,
are to say instead, what is it that I can do in this situation to meet my needs, to make myself feel better, assuming this person is going to keep on doing whatever it is they're doing.
Yeah, that's
It
like a
feels
backwards control. Like, you flipped control. Instead of being so in control of them in like a fawning kind of a way, now you're controlling them by giving them a bunch of demands and expectations. It's still a control mechanism, just the back door of control.
right. And it feels like there's safety in that, right? If I can get you to do this thing that I think you need to do, then I'm going to be able to relax and feel better, right? I'm going to have that sense of emotional safety here. But really, what we want to do is think about how can I create that for myself?
Right.
And often it it's harder in some sense, but it's easier in another. Once you're able to get your head around, like, this is actually a better solution for me. But we sometimes just get stuck on the idea that they should stop doing this thing that is obviously, right, problematic in our relationship or for them as a person.
Yeah.
um but I think once we're able to let go of that idea and say, okay, it's like really just bringing it back to ourselves, and again, less focus on what other people are doing and trying to control that, and
Mm,
more focus on ourselves and how can I be okay.
yeah. Yeah. There's yeah, there's a lot of self words kind of flooding through, because I'm thinking self control, but I'm also thinking self trust, self love, self compassion in here, right? Really getting, and if you've been very self abandoned, really getting to know yourself and finding what actually brings you joy and happiness, because it's not going to be the other person. That's never going to happen, because that would never be a true happy relationship. Even if it looked happy on the outside, even if it didn't look like enmeshment, it didn't smell like codependency, it didn't look like someone was taking advantage. But if all of your happiness and joy is reliant on your partner or your child being okay, that's never going to actually fill the thing for you. But there has to be, I think, moments of like learning to self trust as well, that I'm going to be okay whether or not this person stops this behavior. And I have to decide if I can be around when they're doing it, or if I can be around them in general. But I know I'm going to be okay with or without them, because I'm disconnecting from that enmeshed feeling of needing them to feel safer, to feel okay. That's a real shift in the autonomic nervous system too, because it's not this hyperactivity that's like moving you to be controlling and really, kind of pushing you into this space to make this person a certain way. It's just like a pulling into yourself. It's a settling back in, going, you know what, I'm gonna just be okay. I can be okay. That's a whole different energy. So that's
Yep.
really beautiful.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, it's well said, Sarah.
Mm,
I think it's so much of that. And maybe also you can think of it as a, how can I quiet or manage my own anxiety about this situation? Because to me, there's a big piece of that in sort of feeling okay, feeling at peace in the world, in my body,
yeah.
is feeling like I can settle that anxiety. And again, I
Yeah.
mean, we don't want to be relying on other people to
Oh,
to relieve our anxiety. We want to feel like we can do that ourselves.
yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
much more
Beautiful.
empowered place, really.
It definitely is, because it's the only thing at the end of the day that you can control is yourself and your
Yep.
reactions and how you are. So yeah, work in progress over here of just being calm and in my body and safe in my own space. So I know for those listening, when you're struggling with that, it definitely is a work in progress, slow coming back home, coming back to that seat of consciousness, coming back into yourself and building that self-awareness and that self-trust. So Sharon, thank you so much. We could talk about this for days and days. I want to give you a moment to just share a little bit, because you have a couple of workbooks. You have the CBT, cognitive behavior therapy workbook for perfectionism, and the Better Boundaries workbook, which I probably should be getting both of them. But who should be getting these? And is this a self-therapy model? Is this something that you do in conjunction with a therapist or a coach or an accountability partner, or it can really be done for yourself?
Both of them are books that you can do either with or without adjunctive therapy.
Okay.
So they're intended for folks to be able to pick up as a self-help book, and they're pretty meaty, I would say, but they are both workbooks, which I really like because you're getting sort of the educational piece about what these concepts are about and what they're rooted in, but you're also getting practical therapeutic exercises that you're going to be doing. And some of them are designed for you to be able to do them over and over again so that you get some of that practice in there. So you're actually learning how to do things differently, think about things differently, understand yourself in some different ways. So yeah, from that standpoint, you can do it either way. Um, I think the boundaries is pretty straightforward in terms of, you know, who needs to work on having better boundaries, as you say. In some ways, maybe everybody, but there's a little room for improvement there. I would say, you know, the perfectionism one is sometimes it's a little bit harder for people to identify in themselves.
Yeah.
Again, there are certainly people who will raise their hand immediately and say, oh yes, I know I'm a perfectionist or have perfectionist tendencies here. But
Yeah.
um, sometimes perfectionism doesn't feel like perfectionism, from the standpoint that I think it's like we feel so imperfect that it doesn't feel like it could be perfectionism, because we feel like we're so far away from it, or we're not necessarily, again, sort of consciously thinking about this in terms of I'm trying to be perfect, but it's also I'm constantly needing to do more and sort of be more, achieve more, get external validation so that I can feel okay.
Yeah.
So there's that's part of it as well. So I think the term perfection can almost be a little bit deceptive sometimes, that
Mhm.
it's not
Yeah.
always obvious that it feels like I'm, you know, sort of this classic type A workaholic person. You know,
Right.
perfectionism can manifest in things like procrastination and things like that that feel like it's the opposite of perfectionism, but it's
Yeah.
actually related. So
That is actually a really, really good point, because it is a strange word for something that, if you're struggling with the unworthiness piece, you don't feel like you're ever getting close to achieving. So you're like, well, I'm not a perfectionist, because you don't even want to associate with that word. I will have the link below for both of the workbooks, and also you have some quizzes, some free quizzes on your website as well that I took and I failed miserably, and I'm a work in progress. So, but I'll have those links as well. So if people are wondering how their boundaries are, where they're ranking, and where they are with perfectionism, they can always take that as well. Before I let you go, I just always like to ask everyone, what was one of the most important tools or resources that you were using as you were kind of growing and learning for yourself and healing?
oh, by far, Melody Beattie's Codependent No More was life changing for me. It is the classic in codependency recovery. It's been around for a long, long time. She's revised it, but boy, I'll tell you, I have read that book more than once, and it is solid. If you're struggling with codependency and have not read that, definitely Codependent No
Amazing.
More.
I love that. Dr. Sharon Martin, thank you so much for joining us. Tell people where they can find you, where you are on socials, and I'll have all that linked up in the show notes.
Live Well with Sharon Martin.com is my website.
Awesome.
And in terms of socials, Facebook and Instagram are really what I'm posting on.
I love it. Thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and follow. For any information that was discussed in this podcast episode, check out the show notes below. Until next time, be well.